Welcome, everybody. This is part one of the Orthopedic Practice Strategy and Growth Forum. It's a two-part webinar series, with the second one being this coming Thursday night. I'd like to introduce the speakers. I am Gary Herschman. I am a shareholder at Baker Donelson Law Firm. I'm the co-chair of the Healthcare Transactions Practice. We also have Dana Jacoby, the CEO and founder of Vector Medical Group, and Dana speaks all over the country on strategic transactions for orthopedic surgeons and physicians. Then we're going to hear from Timothy McHale, another healthcare transactions attorney at Baker Donelson. And last but not least, we're going to hear from Scott Bacon, the Senior Vice President for Business Development at Compass Surgical Partners. We're going to be talking about how to strategically position your practice for long-term success, business and legal strategies to maximize practice value, and the importance of income repair and ancillary services. So just for housekeeping, there is a Q&A box. Please submit your questions in the Q&A box as they come up, and we will try to address them as we're talking about these different topics. A PDF of the presentation is going to be available. At the end, it will be emailed to all of the attendees, and the recording will also be circulated. And we hope that at the end you complete the survey at the end of the webinar to give your feedback on how it went and other topics you'd like to hear about. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Dana Jacoby.
Thanks, Gary. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. We're going to talk a little bit, as Gary said, just from a 30,000 foot of what's going on right now in orthopedic practices and how to really position your orthopedic group for success. So, and this is no surprise to anyone, I think, on this call, if you orthopedic MSK spine space for a while. It's just a very evolving environment right now. And I think 2026 has even taken it to a new level of evolution. The macroeconomic headwinds are unbelievable as it relates to elevated interest rate, reimbursement degradation, some of the changes going on. And doctors are just trying to keep up, right? Our orthopedic surgeons and their practices are just really trying to keep up with all of the changes, trying to keep inflation, all the reimbursement degradations taking place. And then I think the biggest one that we're seeing in 2026 is really a valuation gap. A lot of the group looked at their valuation in 2021. Obviously, things have changed quite a bit, right? Interest rates are not more. Cash is a lot more expensive, but also, some things have changed markedly in orthopedic practices that have changed a lot of the way that valuations are being looked at. So I think it's a really just very interesting year, very different from even 2025, which is fascinating. And we're seeing that being affected in a lot of the numbers that we're looking at nationally. When we look at some of the big consolidators nationally and what's happened, we really have hospital and health systems being a big part of some of the folks that are looking at orthopedic practices. I was literally just in the Southeast last week. One of the biggest health systems in the country said, hey, we're really interested in bringing on orthopedic groups as we look into the future. Then, you have a lot of your referral networks. You have Optum. You obviously have other big payer groups playing in the space. And then we know we have private equity backers. So we still have private equity very much front and center in orthopedics. But the neat thing about 2026 and beyond is there's a lot of joint ventures going on across a lot of these different categories. So instead of just being, partnered with one entity or another, like we saw maybe in 2023 or 2024, now we're seeing a lot of joint ventures continuing. The good news for orthopedics is when you include osteoarthritis and rheumatoid arthritis, it's a third of medical spend. So it's a massive market, it's a massive opportunity, and we're not seeing that slow down, right? We all know that people are getting knee replacements, hip replacements, shoulder replacements. Even without pickleball, that trend was on the rise. And we're watching a lot of things change as it relates to the demographics. Still a lot of interest from private equity and family offices in orthopedics, but it's just a definite shift. The other, I think, massive theme, which Scott can talk to, is just the real ramp of the ambulatory surgery center market in this sector. We knew it was coming and we knew it was investable, but it's really becoming a massive part of the future of orthopedics and MSK. And last but not least, you know, I tipped on this, but it's not going away. The interesting thing is it's not just about orthopedics anymore. It's orthopedics, spine, pain, physical therapy. There's a lot of things when you're looking at the runway of how orthopedics is growing. And I think you're going to see a lot of change with even the platform investments that are already in the space, looking at strategically expanding their footprint, I guess pun intended, right? But expanding their footprint into ancillary areas, referral sources, additional ancillaries, and additional specialties that they can bolt on to their overall equation. So it's a very interesting time, never a dull moment in orthopedics. And with that, I'll turn it over to Gary.
Thank you, Dana. So this slide talks about a little depiction of 10 strategic options for physicians to consider in this market. And this was really geared towards, you know, orthopedic practices and musculoskeletal practices. So I'm just going to go through each of these very briefly, and I'm going to go out of order. I'm going to start with number 10, which is remaining independent. There are a lot of groups that are remaining independent, and that is clearly an option to do. Our advice for groups facing challenges, however, due to the competitive marketplace, the increase in costs, and the headwinds with reimbursement and competition in markets, is to at least consider your options. And many groups are considering, you know, just staying independent, but those generally are the bigger groups that have seasoned management teams that can help navigate, you know, like MBAs and other executive types, which the larger groups have, and also access to capital so that they can invest in ancillary services to try to keep revenue and profits and compensation going up and not going down. But it is becoming more difficult for smaller and mid-sized practices to do those, to stay independent. So some of the options, I'm now going to go, you know, to item 7, which is a pure MSO. Practices that want to stay independent and don't have the seasoned management team and are looking for some guidance can contract with a seasoned MSO with experienced executives, managed care contracting, HR oversight, all those types of things, and maybe access to capital. You need to find an MSO, and there are some out there that focus on orthopedics that you could turn to, but that is another option. Now I'm going to go back up to the top. Private equity platforms. Everyone's been talking about that. It's been pretty hot, you know, starting in 2019 for the, you know, last 5 or 6 years. There are pros and cons to private equity, and some physicians have a knee-jerk negative reaction to it. But that being said, there, you know, in our experience, 80 to 90%, not all the time, but 80 to 90% of the time, these work out great. The doctors get, we'll talk a little bit more about later, income repair, and they have this corporate infrastructure and seasoned management team to help them. The most important thing with private equity and any of these other options, partnering with another party, is to do extensive diligence on the partner that you potentially will be considering going with. So the second option here is family office platform. And transacting with a family office can provide capital for expansion. And what's good is that unlike private equity platforms, they have a longer outlook, 10 plus years, as to how long they're going to stay invested and keep investing in the growth of, in this case, an orthopedic platform, whereas private equity investors generally look to exit on average 5 years. Sometimes it's 7, sometimes it's 3. And the other good thing about family office platforms is, versus private equity, is they are a little bit more deferential to the physicians that work with the group. The third option here is to sell to a hospital. The biggest factor here is trust. I'm sure half of the orthopedic surgeons listening and out there in general don't trust their hospital, whereas maybe the other half have a great relationship with their hospital. So it really varies based on your geography and the hospitals and competing hospitals in your region. And do you trust them? And there still are concerns about what happens when the hospital leadership changes, potentially slow erosion of any types of governance rights you can negotiate, and potential modification of compensation formulas into the future, as fair market value may arguably go down because hospitals have to rely on fair market value for legal compliance. A fourth option are three-way joint ventures between a hospital and a private equity platform. We're starting to see some of those. In fact, the Hospital for Special Surgery announced a joint venture with General Atlantic, a private equity platform, and its physicians for ASCs, for orthopedic-focused ASCs. And there have been other similar joint ventures in anesthesia and some other specialties, so including cardiology. So we think that may potentially grow in the future as an option as the market matures. The fifth option, merging into a mega group down towards the bottom of the slide. I mean, this option is not new at all. It's been around for a while. The challenge is, does this mega group, a larger group, maybe 30, 40, 50 orthopedic surgeons, does it have access to capital to grow, to invest in new ancillary services like ASCs in particular, and imaging and physical therapy and all the other ancillaries that are important? The sixth option is a payer-sponsored provider group. One example of that is Optum, which is part of United Healthcare, but other payers like Elevance, which is Blue Cross, Aetna, Cigna, all are acquiring physician practices. And I think most of the physicians I speak to are a little bit concerned about going to, a payer-sponsored platform that they're, going to have to be forced to follow clinical policies that they might not agree to, and, just be relegated to just employees without any say in things. But I think some of the payer platforms are changing a little bit, and, the jury's still out on that. Number 8 is a PSA with a hospital. We are still seeing, and we are still working on PSAs between orthopedic groups and, everything from spine to, even including rheumatology, pain management, all the full spectrum of musculoskeletal services. And what's nice is that the physicians partner with a hospital. And again, there needs to be the trust factor there. And they get paid $1 per work RVU for their services. And I think the biggest advantage there versus selling to a hospital and becoming employed is that you still have your independent practice entity. You could terminate the PSA at any time, usually on a long period of notice, like 180 days or more, 1 year I've seen, and go back to private practice. So that's another option that's out there. And then finally, which is item 9 here, because I did go out of order a little bit. Item 9 here is an ESOP, which is an employee stock ownership plan. We are starting to see this option being considered or effectuated with larger groups that have a sophisticated management structure. And it's really used as a way to let founders kind of exit and bring in ownership in the practice to other doctors. And you can have it be for all employees, not just physicians. And it still maintains control because there's a trust involved, but the trust, is selected. The trustee is selected by the practice in doing the transaction. And it provides a lot of tax advantages, and is something that is now catching on as doctors want to be still in control of their practice and still remain independent. The next thing I'm going to talk about is, and by the way, we do not have, different slides for each of these topics. We're just the slides are more directional. I saw that there was a question about that. But if anybody would like more detailed slides on this, we do have that, and just email us, and we're happy to provide more details on these in terms of a much more robust presentation deck. So the next topic is planning in advance to maximize the value of a partnership transaction. So these are 5 practical tips that if you're going to partner, after considering all the options, groups may stay independent, but if you're going to consider partnering with, a hospital, a private equity platform, a family office, any of those other options, just from doing this for in excess of 30 years, I have these practical tips that I think are important. Number 1 is get early consensus amongst the stakeholders, the doctors in the group, the shareholders. Get early consensus. Sometimes I've seen groups, like the board of a group going very far along without getting the buy-in from the other members of the group. And it usually causes huge delays, and a lot of education is needed to get them up to speed. Our advice is to keep them up to speed and get consensus from the very beginning going forward. It makes the transaction so much easier if you decide to pull the trigger and move forward, because then everybody's on board. Everyone sees the different options that were considered, and and feels more part of the process, asking questions along the way instead of feeling like it's being forced on them by the board of a group. Secondly, another discuss and agree on early is, how are proceeds of a transaction going to be allocated? A number of these strategic partnership options involve proceeds coming to the group, some type of sale or other liquidity. And it's really important not to go too far down the road without not only having consensus on moving down the road, but having consensus of, okay, if we do a deal and there's an influx of proceeds, how are we going to split it? Now, a lot of you are just thinking, well, if, it's based on ownership, right? Everybody owns one share, or, everyone owns equally, which a lot of groups are structured that way historically, then everything gets split equally. But some of these transactions involve normalization of compensation. And sometimes doctors that have a much higher compensation due to their productivity, their subspecialty, what have you, are going to take a bigger hit to their comp. And in those groups, it's very common for the desire to be for the bigger earners that take a bigger sacrifice in a deal, a bigger normalization or reduction in comp, that they get a bigger piece of the proceeds. So it's very important to be upfront about that and to come up with a methodology as to how that's going to happen when you go down the road. And then thirdly, you have to look at your legal structure, to make sure you could structure the transaction in the most tax efficient way. So for instance, I'll give two examples. I just spoke about proceeds allocation. Almost every group I've ever worked with hasn't really, thought about their shareholder agreement or operating agreement provision on what happens if there's a sale. And almost all the time when this started many years ago, when the group started, it could be 10, 20 plus years ago, or even 5 years ago, the boilerplate is, oh, we split it based on on ownership percentage, which is equal. However, if you're looking to do something different, you should speak to counsel and get your documents amended as early as possible when you're starting to consider a potential transaction like that. You don't want to wait until on the eve of a transaction closing, or even after you get a letter of intent. It's best to do this as much in advance as possible. And there could be other tax structuring that's needed, because in certain types of entities that are taxed as S corps, S corporations, or even C corporations, for S corporations, the proceeds have to be equal. So you have to look at other options for a unequal allocation of proceeds based on productivity and other factors. And you similarly have to do that with a C corporation. You have more flexibility in a partnership, like an LLC taxed as a partnership. So those are things that are important. But even in the LLC taxed as a partnership, you still need to amend your agreements to say how you're going to whack up the proceeds, again, as far in advance of the transaction as possible. Also, item 4, if you own real estate, if the group owns real estate, and it's usually not the group itself, but in a separate real estate investment entity, like an LLC usually, and you own one or more parcels of real estate, buildings, condos where the practice has offices, it's very important, because a lot of times doctors don't think about it because it's our practice, it's our real estate, and there's not usually an arm's length, fully commercial lease in place. And if you ever want to sell that real estate down the road, prior to doing a partnership transaction, you really need to put in place a really commercial arm's length lease, like it would be if you rented from a third party, so that when you do your partnership transaction, that more robust form of lease is what's assumed by your partner. And by doing that, it enhances the value of that real estate should you ever want to sell it. Now that you've done a partnership, there's quote unquote an anchor tenant, a bigger company involved, and it will enhance the value of your real estate for a potential future sale, whether it be a few years later or many years later. Lastly, it's important to, and this is Tim, my colleague Tim is going to talk about this, is to do an assessment early on of potential compliance issues. I can't tell you how many deals we work on where compliance issues come up when the potential partner is doing due diligence, or buyer is doing due diligence, and that causes a lot of delay, increased costs, and lower valuation. So I'll turn it over to Tim.
Thanks, Gary. So what's important to note here is that when a buyer is evaluating your practice, whether it's a health system, a PE-backed platform, or another competing practice, their team isn't just looking at your financials. Sure, that's very important, but they're also going to deploy a sophisticated diligence team whose sole job is to find problems. This is why in a deal setting, unresolved compliance gaps, they don't stay hidden. And every gap that a buyer finds can be used as leverage, whether it's a purchase price reduction, an escrow holdback, a large indem reserve, or in the worst case, a dead deal. In our experience, buyers do not pay for uncertainty. They price it in or they walk away. The good news, most of the gaps that hurt sellers are very fixable, and they're cheap to fix as well. The practices that come to market with a clean diligence story command stronger valuations and close deals on better terms. So I'm going to walk you through some common compliance issues that we have seen come up, as well as the strategies you can use to fix them well before you go to market. So first is monthly exclusion checks. As a quick background, federal law prohibits healthcare providers from employing or contracting with people that have been excluded from the participation in federal healthcare programs. The OIG maintains an actual list of excluded people, and most states maintain their own separate list as well. So you're probably asking, why does this matter? If an excluded person is on the payroll and the practice has been billing Medicare or Medicaid for that individual's services, the practice faces potential civil monetary penalties plus certain other damages. A buyer that sees that a practice has never run exclusion checks or only checks at hire will see this as a liability and could potentially reduce the purchase price or demand some sort of indemnity escrow or holdback. The good news, as I mentioned above, this is a very easy fix. Practices should implement a policy to screen all employees, independent contractors, and other staff against both the federal exclusion list and any state list that applies. So this should be done both at the time of hire and on a monthly basis going forward. You can do this either directly yourself, or you can hire a vendor who will do this for you. But either way, each monthly check should be documented. So next on the list here is corporate compliance policies. The OIG has issued guidance for practice compliance programs, which calls for certain core elements, including written standards of conduct, anonymous reporting mechanisms, a non-retaliation policy, and regular compliance training. This is important because buyers want to come in and they expect a documented compliance program to be in place. Practices that lack these elements can indicate to a buyer that problems may be there that are not being seen. Best practice to have a clean compliance program includes having actual written policies and procedures, establishing a compliance officer, having annual training and education sessions throughout the year, establishing open lines of communication with all employees, and responding promptly to detected offenses. So here, a non-retaliation policy is actually pretty important. It's buyers like to see that employees feel safe reporting concerns without fear of termination or other issues at work. In all of these policies, it's important that they're documented. So staying with the compliance theme, another big item is HIPAA compliance. As I'm sure you all know, HIPAA requires covered entities to implement certain safeguards to protect PHI. Key elements include workforce training, periodic risk assessments, privacy policies, secure email and texting platforms, password protected phones and other items, and encrypted data transfers. A data breach that comes up during diligence, or worse, evidence that the practice has never conducted a risk assessment, is a red flag that can really hurt a deal. The fix here includes conducting a formal HIPAA risk assessment, ideally with a third-party vendor, adopting and updating privacy and security policies, training all workforce members upon hire and each year thereafter. So it's not just one time at hire, it's happening every year. And ensuring that email and texting at PHI uses compliant platforms. Specifically for ortho practices, it's really important to watch out for unsecured imaging data, patient portal vulnerabilities, and texting of PHI through non-compliant platforms. So moving on here, you should also be aware of basic coding and documentation auditing. Practices should periodically perform internal audits of billing, coding, and clinical documentation, particularly for high volume and high reimbursement CPT codes. This is really important to ID any issues that might be going on. For orthopedic practices, which, as you know, frequently bill high value surgical codes and ancillary services like imaging, PT, and DME, coding errors can translate into significant overpayment exposure. A buyer will want to see that the practice has been auditing itself and fixing issues. The absence of any audit history at all shows that the practice has no idea whether its revenue was quote unquote clean, and buyers may discount projected revenue accordingly. Here, the best way to proceed is to engage a certified coder or outside coding consultant to conduct these periodic audits. And all findings should be documented, and a corrective action plan should be created for any issues that come up. Also, it's really important that all identified overpayments are refunded as promptly as possible. So next, we're going to talk about mid-levels. Orthopedic practices frequently employ PAs and NPs. Both state law and federal billing rules impose specific supervision requirements and incident to billing, where, as you all know, the mid-level services are billed under the supervising doctor's NPI. They have strict regulatory requirements. Improper incident to billing is a common audit target, but practice has been billing mid-level services at physician rates without meeting the actual supervision requirements. The resulting overpayment liability can be substantial. A buyer performing revenue diligence will scrutinize this closely, and any identified exposure could require an indemnity carve-out or affect the purchase price. For orthopedic practices, especially those that rely on mid-levels for post-operative care, injections, and other things like first assist roles, this area really is important to have close attention to. So moving on, it's important to also have certain key employment policies in place. Practices should maintain compliant policies covering things such as employee overtime, family and medical leave, disability accommodations, anti-harassment training, and employee benefit plan compliance. This matters because employment litigation, especially wage and hour claims, is one of the most common sources of liability in healthcare transactions. It's not uncommon for medical practices to misclassify staff as exempt versus non-exempt, not pay overtime as required by law, and not comply with family leave, disability, and other employee protection laws. A practice looking to clean this up should engage employment counsel to audit and update the employee handbook, review all overtime classifications, and review leave policies and anti-harassment training, which is actually mandatory in many states. So next, we're going to talk about comp. Specifically incentive compensation and regulatory compliance. If your orthopedic practice provides designated health services under the Stark Law, such as in-office imaging, physical therapy, lab services, or DME, then any productivity-based compensation paid to your physicians must comply with Stark's compensation exceptions. A Stark violation can render every referral for DHS from the non-compliant physician as improper, which creates overpayment liability and potential False Claims Act exposure. Buyers are very sensitive to Stark risks because there is no intent requirement. It's a strict liability statute. A non-compliant incentive compensation formula can really hurt a deal, and we've seen this come up a few times. The best fix here is to have a healthcare regulatory council take a look at all doctor compensation arrangements to confirm they're compliant. And then beyond the internal compensation structure, the practice, it's really important for the practice to confirm that all arrangements with outside entities, things like space and equipment leases, medical director agreements, joint venturers, and other items in that same sphere, that they all comply with the Stark Law and the anti-kickback statute. Orthopedic practices have a complex referral systems, as you all know. Patients are referred to imaging centers, PT clinics, ASCs, DME suppliers, and the practices receive referrals from primary care doctors. Any arrangement that involves compensation flowing between a potential referral source and the practice must meet a relevant exception or safe harbor. And as I just mentioned, the best fix here is to engage healthcare regulatory counsel, who can conduct a comprehensive review and confirm each arraignment meets the relevant STAR exception and anti-kickback safe harbor. So next, this item sometimes slips under the radar. It's copay waivers. Some practices routinely waive patient copays and deductibles as a courtesy or even as a competitive measure. So federal law generally prohibits the routine waiver of copays for services reimbursed by federal healthcare programs, as it could potentially constitute an illegal inducement under the anti-kickback statute or a violation of the False Claims Act. Routine copay waivers are also an OIG enforcement priority. If the practice has a pattern of waiving copays without any documented financial hardship assessment, a buyer can flag this as both a compliance risk and a potential revenue adjustment issue, as this can be viewed as the practice under collecting. So here, the best way to fix this is to adopt a compliant copay collection and waiver policy. So one that requires a patient application, an individualized assessment of financial hardship, and documentation for the basis of any waiver. Another item that we've seen come up in many deals is credit balances. So credit balances arise when a practice receives an overpayment from a patient or a payer. Federal and state laws require timely identification and repayment of such overpayments. Specifically under the federal 60-day overpayment rule, a provider that identifies any overpayment from a federal healthcare program must report and return it within 60 days. Otherwise, it's possible to face liability under the False Claims Act. And more importantly, aged credit balances sitting on the practice's books are both a compliance and a financial liability that buyers will identify during diligence. This comes up a lot. To ensure that you will not have any credit balance issues, practices should run a credit balance report, identify all outstanding overpayments, and repay them to the appropriate patients and payers on either a quarterly or a semi-annually basis. You should also implement a policy for ongoing identification and timely refund of credit balances. All right, so just a couple more items here. Next is the stimulus grants and loans. So while not as prevalent as this was a few years ago, many practices did receive either provider relief fund or paycheck protection program loans during COVID. Both programs came with significant compliance strengths, including use of fund restrictions, reporting requirements, and verification obligations. So we typically see buyers wanting to confirm that the practice properly used these funds in accordance with program terms, completed all of the required reporting, and documented any loan forgiveness. So to get ahead of this issue, practices should compile all documentation of all the funds they received, how those funds were used, and evidence of any loan for forgiveness that went on. And last but not least is ASCs. Many orthopedic practices have affiliated or co-owned ASCs, which are subject to all of the compliance requirements that I just talked about, plus additional regulatory requirements unique to the ASC setting. So these include things like CMS conditions for coverage, specific anti-kickback safe harbor requirements for surgeon investors, and even rules around providing free transportation to patients. ASC ownership is often a significant component of an ortho's practice, and specifically the practice's overall value. So compliance issues at the ASC level can really reduce that value. And this is one item that buyers diligence very, very thoroughly, if not more so than the practice itself. So to wrap things up here, it's really important to understand that the time to address these issues is before the practice goes to market, not during diligence when every compliance gap becomes a negotiating chip for the buyer. Proactive compliance tune-up 12 to 18 months before a transaction takes place really protects the seller's valuation. It reduces any exposure during the deal and shortens the path to closing. So next, I'm going to turn things over to Scott Bacon to talk about income repair.
Tim, thank you. As Gary, Tim, Dana all touched on, everything around the physician practice will create a pathway to ancillary revenue sources. So we're going to dive into ancillary revenue sources here, and sometimes referred to as income repair, as Tim mentioned. Before I dive in, I do want to mention, just remind everybody, on the right, there's a Q&A box. If anything, questions came to mind through any of the discussion here this evening, feel free to drop those into the Q&A box. We will touch on those here as we wrap up in a few minutes. So as Gary mentioned, there's a wheel of 10 practice options, strategic options for physicians and their practices and various structures. The three we see most commonly, I would bucket into independent, remaining as an independent practice, usually in a partnership model. We're seeing some physicians just be straight W-2 employees with the health system. And then lastly, more and more the private equity-backed MSO structure. In all of these, there's various trade-offs to control, capital requirements, risk components. Gary touched on a lot of those details, but the one thing we want to point out is access to ancillary revenue. There's various streams of ancillary revenue in addition to your pro fee, everything from ASC ownership that we'll dive into here in more detail in a moment, owning the practice real estate, basically being your own landlord. There's access to lab partnerships and DME, and there's an extensive list. But what we continue to see in the industry and in the data is ambulatory surgery center ownership, if structured appropriately, if operated efficiently, if run well, those are going to be probably the most optimized and largest revenue stream comparative to others out there in the market. So let's dive in. I'm going to skip a few slides here. So what we see in the ancillary revenue field with specific to ASCs is that if these are run well, and we'll come back to what that means, these can generate up to 30% of your professional fee income or your practice-based income. It's not an it's not a small number by any means. So what creates success? First and foremost, we need to create the operating environment that a physician demands, quite frankly, in today's world. It needs to be set up efficiently. You need to have the equipment and implants that you need and desire that are clinically appropriate. You need to have the team that's in there on a day in and day out basis that knows the surgeon, knows what he needs. Creating that, what's been described as a silent symphony at times, that efficient operating environment enables surgeons to do their best work on a consistent basis, day in and day out. So creating the optimal environment where the physician wants to make that their primary surgical venue week in and week out is first and foremost. To do that, the surgeons need to have a voice. In all of our partnerships, we have the surgeons with active members of the board, of the leadership committees. The surgeons need to have a voice and a pathway to implementing change, whether it be changing the implant vendors or the suppliers or replacing staff, changing the schedule, integrating with the practice from a scheduling perspective. All of that is important to make sure that we can create the most efficient operating environment that the surgeons will look forward to using day in and day out. So outside of the operating environment, what else? What else can help optimize the financial performance of these partnerships? When you're setting these up, it's really getting the equity model structured appropriately. This can be everything from the practice having direct ownership, from an LLC of the physician utilizers having a direct ownership, or the surgeons investing directly. Pros and cons of each. We're not going to get into those tonight. As you're considering appropriate equity structures, highly recommend engaging a healthcare attorney. Gary and Tim are very seasoned and experienced in this nature. So someone who has worked and represented physicians specific in ASCs is an important component when you're considering an advisor in that regard. Physicians have the option to manage these and run these businesses themselves. They are mini hospitals to an extent. They're very complex operating environments and operating entities. You have the ability to hire staff and control that and run that yourself. We see more and more surgeons and practices engaging with a partner, specific to ASC experienced management partner. Pros and cons of each, trade-offs both ways. What we've seen is the trade-off in a management fee or potentially an equity partner is usually well outperformed by the benefits that partner brings. One of those, as we jump over to the next bucket, could be access to a group purchasing organization, or a GPO, it's known as. These can create leverage when you're buying supplies, you're aggregating on a larger spend across all the management partners, other centers. So you're creating a buying power and ultimately a reduced supply cost at your facility. Another component to think about as we're structuring ASCs is anesthesia. In today's world, both in the operating environment, anesthesia is continuing to be more and more of a focal point and a strategic discussion. The reimbursement rates in anesthesia have been compressed. If it's not a highly efficient operating environment, anesthesia providers are requesting income guarantees or subsidies. What are some strategies to try to reduce or remove those? It's really working closely with the practice, with the ASC, with the anesthesia provider, and trying to create a very cohesive schedule to ensure you can minimize, if not reduce those subsidies as much as possible. Another key component to operating an ASC is the managed care contracts. The payers, the commercial payers, are becoming more and more savvy. Negotiating, going into those negotiations armed with data is going to be extremely important. There's many data sources out there. The new transparency tools aggregate this data. You can go into these negotiations armed. The payers are very armed and have all the data. So working with an expert in this field is very, very important. One of the ways to significantly hinder the financial performance of a center is to sign a managed care contract that is below market or not structured appropriately. One example of that is are implants reimbursed outside of the facility fee agreement. So there's different strategies, different carve-outs, different ways to negotiate those. Again, the payers are very, very savvy, so you want to make sure you go into that armed and with an expert who's been at that table many, many times over. I'll jump down to implant negotiations. Implants are a key component. We're seeing more and more total joints and spine cases that include high-cost implants. The acuity mix has shifted upstream, if you will, in the ASC space here recently. It's increased the reimbursements. It's also increased the cost per case, both from supplies and implants. This also ties into robotics. We're seeing more and more robotics in the outpatient setting. While the standard of care and the quality of care is increasing with those for most surgeons that are coming out of fellowship, there is a component to that. There's an increase in cost associated with those on a per case basis. The key to that is making sure you're working with your implant vendors holistically. Some are very, very in tune with the ASC setting, trying to grow their presence in that. There's very savvy negotiations and agreements that the implant vendors are working with ASCs on. Again, you've got to be very diligent in your analysis, in reading the contracts. I will say there's no such thing as a free robot. They're not giving away, they're not in the business to give away free robots or free implants. So really peel that onion back, again, work with an expert who's negotiated those exact agreements with that vendor before, and what has been the outcome? What has been 3 to 5 years later? Make sure it was performed as expected, as it's been presented on the front end. And then lastly is what is the exit? What is the opportunity? Gary touched on this, making sure the agreements are set up from a partnership standpoint of how exit proceeds are handled. What are your exit options? Is it just one surgeon retiring and being replaced by another? Is he selling those shares directly to another surgeon or back to the center or back to the practice? Is it a majority transaction where you're selling a portion of the shares, usually 51% or more, to a strategic buyer, whether it's a health system or a consolidator in the space that Dana touched on some of the earlier in the presentation here. So many options out there. It's these become, if they're set up well, they're run efficiently, they have the right governance structure in place. These can be extremely efficient to operate if the surgeons have a voice. They can also be very desirable from a transaction standpoint for a potential buyer. So again, these are just a few highlights of various levers to help optimize the center. If you have good contracts and a lot of volume, they can perform well. We always think about how can they be optimized and make sure they're returning the most they can to the shareholders and the physician investors. The last topic I'll touch on is, in any of the areas that we touched on tonight, there's 4 key components. Tim went very deep into the compliance. I think Gary, Dana, and I, and Tim have seen all of those come into play as we've gone through transactions, whether it's in the diligence, whether it killed it, whether it compromised the purchase price. So being compliant, making sure you're going into that eyes wide open is extremely important. Next is, as you're looking at numbers, there's a lot of PowerPoints and a lot of commas and dollar signs thrown out there. Really understand the assumptions that are going into those numbers, stress test those, evaluate the downside. What's the worst case scenario before you make some of these strategic decisions, most of which you're only going to get to make once or twice in your career. Make sure you understand all of the variables and you agree with them. Lastly, the fine print. All of these are going to come with glossy presentations. Eventually, there's going to be legal agreements to support those and enter into definitive agreements that document the transaction. Obviously, there are a lot of language in there. Highly recommend an attorney to review that on your behalf. But just understanding the key components, what's in the fine print, and how's that going to change your day-to-day practice or day-to-day surgical venue post-transaction. Lastly, can't say this one loud enough. Surgeons are great at what they do. They're not always known to be the best business folks because they're seeing patients all day, every day. Work with a team of advisors. Understand who you can trust, who is representing you and your best interest. This is not only a healthcare attorney, but you have to think about it from the lens of taxes. So a CPA that has experience in this regard, as well as an experienced financial advisor. Yeah, and the financial advisor helps you compare not only the practice options, but as you're thinking about these from an investment standpoint, how this investment compares to other options that you have out there. So make sure you have the team that you can trust and has your best interest at heart. All right, with that, I'm gonna go ahead and pass the mic back over to Gary.
Well, if there are any questions, feel free to enter them into the Q&A box. And if there are no other questions, then I just want to point out to everybody that part 2 of this webinar series is Thursday, this coming Thursday, May 21st at 7 p.m. Central. So that's 6 p.m. Pacific and 8 p.m. Eastern. And the topics to be covered are how to extricate from a PSA or employment with a hospital, which we've been getting a lot of inquiries about and are advising certain doctors and big groups of doctors that are considering leaving employment or a PSA with a hospital. So they're going in, they're coming out. What to do. The second topic is what to do to maximize the future value of your medical real estate. I spoke about it for 2 minutes. There's an expert on this that's going to be talking about it in much more detail for 10 to 15 minutes. And lastly, personal wealth strategies for orthopedic surgeons considering a strategic transaction. There are lots of things you should be doing personally if you're going to be receiving or anticipating receiving proceeds in advance of a transaction. So with that being said, if there's no questions, then thank you very much for joining us. And we hope you join us again on Thursday evening. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.